Good morning. My name is Elaine Rogers. I'm a clinical psychologist coming to you from University of Limerick in the west of Ireland. At the outset, I'd like to thank the conference committee for inviting me to speak today. I'm honoured to be part of this conference highlighting the importance of human rights and psychology and disability rights and justice within that. I've called this talk Seen, Unseen and Seldom Heard to reflect ideas about where we see disabled people in society and where we don't. Disabled people are overrepresented in less desirable social environments, underrepresented in more valued environments, and are often not included in the decision-making that affects their lives. I'm taking this opportunity to highlight a pattern of challenges faced by disabled people and to encourage psychologists to reflect on ways we can support disabled people to be more equitably represented in society. I want to acknowledge the complexities, multiplicities and intersectionalities at play in the lives of disabled people. In this short talk, I've selected some issues to highlight. There are, of course, many more. In this talk, I use both person-first and identity-first language. To set some context, the World Health Organization and the World Bank produced the World Disability Report in 2011. The first report of its kind, it estimated that about 15% of the global population live with some form of disability, of whom 2 to 4% experience significant difficulties in functioning. That's about 1 billion people. Disabled people, the biggest minority group, are a heterogeneous population with disabilities ranging from physical to sensory to cognitive, from congenital to acquired across the lifespan. Some disabilities are obvious to onlookers, while others are hidden. Disabled people in developing countries, the Global South, form about 80% of the world's 1 billion people with disabilities and 20% of the world's poorest and most disadvantaged people. Disabled people face challenges in both developing or low to middle income countries and developed or higher income countries. Although those challenges may differ, realising certain rights such as physical access may seem far removed from the experiences of some of the Global South where food security and clean water is priority. All experiences must be honoured in their own context. My own experiences in Ireland have taught me that we still have a way to go here. Just to note that there are some challenges with prevalence estimates in disability. For example, the lack of a uniform definition of disability, the use of different terminology. Some data is generated by self-report measures, others by a range of objective measures. And to note also that there is a goal to gather reliable disability relevant data. Where disabled people are seen or overrepresented are environments such as residential institutions, childcare proceedings, prisons, in violent circumstances and in poverty. Looking first at institutions, as psychologists, you'll be aware of the history of institutionalisation and the role of our profession in it. Despite the policy of deinstitutionalisation, this effort remains incomplete in both developed and developing countries. Disabled people continue to live in institutions. Where deinstitutionalisation has taken place, it has not always been mirrored with appropriate community-based supports, which has at times undermined its success. Cumulative evidence from the UK, Ireland, Canada and Australia indicate there is also a risk of reinstitutionalisation, as a high number of disabled people live in aged care facilities, many at a relatively young age and often not because of their own choice or their own needs. In the civil domain of childcare proceedings, the international evidence indicates that parents with cognitive impairment are disproportionately represented in childcare proceedings. They are more likely to lose their children than any other group of parents. This is often on the grounds of neglect rather than abuse. One of the concerning things about this situation is that there are often no dedicated supports for parents with cognitive impairment prior to childcare proceedings. The international evidence again indicates that people with intellectual disability are overrepresented in prison settings. There's no evidence to support the idea that there's a greater rate of offending in the intellectual disability population. There are complex factors at play, including perhaps that people with intellectual disability are less likely to evade conviction and less likely to take advantage of their right to remain silent. In terms of violence and violent circumstances, it is now well established that disabled people are more likely to be victims of crime and to experience abuse and violence. Very sadly, the consequences of violence and conflict are often permanent disabilities in both children and adults. From the perspective of poverty, disabled people around the globe are more likely to live in poverty than their non-disabled peers. United Nations data report that while data is limited, the proportion of disabled people living on or under the international poverty line is higher and in some cases double than their non-disabled people. In environments in both criminal and civil contexts and around the globe, where an individual's rights and freedoms are curtailed and resources and opportunities limited, we see an overrepresentation of disabled people. In contrast, in socially valued roles and environments, disabled people are not so prominent. For example, in education, including further and higher education, in employment and in popular culture, sport, fashion, music and media, and in positions of power, we tend not to see disabled people being represented. Thinking about education, while progress has been made in many countries regarding education in general, children with disabilities have fared less well. About 40% of children with disabilities are out of school at primary level in developing countries. There are challenges in both developed and developing countries. Not unlike community living, access doesn't necessarily mean inclusion. There's a need for a differentiated curriculum with an emphasis on learning, not only socialisation. It's therefore not surprising that the rates of disabled people in higher education are low, although they have improved in OECD countries. I've included here some links to stories about disabled people and their university experiences. As a general rule around the globe, disabled people of working age are underrepresented in the workforce, despite their desire to work. There are complex relationships between disability, education and training, employment and poverty. Some of my colleagues in the Disability Stakeholders Group here in Ireland have expressed concern in the wake of COVID-19 that working from home might now be the only accommodation offered to disabled people, and that is not sufficient or acceptable. I'm conscious I'm trying to do a lot in this talk, and without minimising the impact of underrepresentation in education and employment, I would like to flag the absence of representation of people with disabilities in popular culture and in industries like sport, fashion, music and media. For example, despite positive developments in disability sport, elite athletes with disabilities rarely feature in the media. While we have recently seen an increase in disabled people's representation in the media, and while this is welcome, sometimes negative stereotypes are reinforced. While disabled people have been active and strong advocates for many years, it continues to be the case that the voice of disabled people, although chiming stronger, is in some parts of the world and in some circumstances seldom heard. And within the disabled person's community itself, there are some voices that are heard less than others. For example, people with severe and profound intellectual disability, or people with multiple and complex needs. The Disabled People International Group have a particular focus on neglected countries and neglected disabilities, including leprosy. In terms of participation, disabled people's organisations enjoy different status in different countries. In some jurisdictions, there are dedicated structures and statutory funding. In other places, this is yet to come. To participate in community, in local government, or national or international processes, disabled people need access, supports and resources. They need enabling environments. In terms of decision making, people with disabilities were and are very often excluded from decisions that affected their lives. I give one example here in this slide about accommodation. There's an emerging body of work on supported decision making, restoring autonomy to adults with cognitive impairment or mental health difficulties that we as psychologists need to be familiar with. We're seeing some positive change. One of the great drivers of change is the disability rights movement and the United Nations Convention for Persons with Disabilities, which came into force in 2008 and identifies 26 important rights for persons with disabilities. As this map, taken from the United Nations website shows, there was a very positive response to the aspirations of the UN CRPD. Interestingly, and perhaps tellingly, there is less political interest in the optional. The United Nations Agenda for Sustainable Development is an ambitious plan to leave no one behind, with an emphasis on dignity and equality as fundamental principles. It is aligned with the CRPD and has 7 targets explicitly referring to disabled people. While the influence of the CRPD is evident, as yet the gap yawns between the promise of the treaty and the reality of people with disabilities. And there are, however, limitations, criticisms and concerns of and about the human rights movement in general and the disability rights movement in particular, including that it is a single-issue identity-based and that it centres people who can achieve rights and access through a legal or rights-based framework, which is considered not possible for many disabled people. To address those limitations, the Disability Justice Framework was proposed. The movement emphasises intersectionality and the multiplicity of identity, taking account of gender, race, culture and other factors. It highlights the experiences of multiply oppressed persons, disabled women and girls, people living in extreme poverty in the Global South. The Disability Justice Framework encourages us to use the best of the disability rights movement, but not to stop there, to look before and beyond a rights-based approach. I attempted, if what somewhat clumsily and superficially, to make a central point, that despite advances and ambitions in disability law and policy and in the disability justice movement, and while there has certainly been some progress for some disabled people, there remains a general pattern that disabled people are overrepresented in unfavourable circumstances. Residential institutions, prisons, childcare proceedings, poverty and violence, and underrepresented in more favourable circumstances, higher education, employment, and socially valued roles. If I may now reflect on the role that psychology can play at micro, meso and macro levels. I won't mention research and theory here, as my colleague in the symposium is addressing these. What we can do, in terms of our practice, is educate ourselves on disability rights and disability justice. We can look to disabled leaders and listen to the experiences of disabled people. At broader macro levels, psychologists can become involved with human rights monitoring. At national and international levels, we can lend voice to support DPOs in their advocacy, and we can advocate for those who cannot advocate for themselves. We can challenge institutional stigma, including challenging language and terminology that offends dignity. Terms like lunatic that persist on the statute books and mental age that persist in courtrooms. We can ensure equity of access to psychological services and best practice and quality of services to disabled people. We can champion inclusion and respect for disabled people within our communities and in our own practices, in what we can control, in what Eleanor Roosevelt called the small places. Integrating a human rights approach within our practice, empowering our clients within therapeutic relationships, adapting assessment models and tools so they are culturally and disability sensitive. We can use our skills in formulation and collaboration to synthesize complex systemic information including gender, culture, race and more, so that our interventions, treatments and therapies are informed and designed for the whole person. We can take the concept of reasonable accommodation and use it to advocate for and to develop bespoke supports and services. While psychologists can and should work within broader systems, bringing psychological thinking to those systems, we must also hold on to our space of working with the individual and honouring each person's individual experience. I have given a rather whistle-stop tour of the disability landscape today, highlighting a pattern whereby disabled people are seen, unseen and seldom heard, a pattern that persists despite advances in disability law and policy and disability justice. We are seeing progress and change though, and we should hold on to hope and ambition and be open to being part of that change. Thank you.